Welcome. In this video on the United States Civil War, we will conclude the campaign of 1862 and explore the beginnings of the Emancipation movement as a result of the Civil War. Last time we talked about the war in the West, how the Confederacy had advanced into Kentucky, withdrawn to Forts Henry and Donelson, which were taken by U.S. Grant. Grant then won narrowly the Battle of Shiloh. He was then replaced by his own commander, who was General Halleck, who began to creep, McClellan style, towards Corinth, Mississippi. A lot of the Union advance was thrown away in October of 1862 as a Confederate attack deep into Kentucky threatening Ohio caused the Union to pull back but win at the Battle of Perryville in October of 1862 and push the Confederates back. Back in the East, on the Peninsular Campaign, McClellan had floated his army to the York-James Peninsula, earned the nickname the Virginia Creeper as he slowly crept his enormous army up to Richmond, was able to be ridden around by the cavalry of Confederate General Jeb Stuart, and then won 6 of the 7 days' battles against Robert E. Lee, but retreated after all 7. And as a result of this, McClellan called for another 100,000 men, which Lincoln could not give him. And since McClellan said he could not advance without another 100,000 men, Lincoln ordered him to return. So as the advanced outfits of McClellan's army are being floated back to Washington, Lincoln doesn't exactly fire McClellan yet. He just, as one by one the regiments are floated back to Washington, he puts them under command of another general, John Pope, Union General John Pope, and he orders him to advance overland towards Richmond rather than while McClellan is still on the peninsula. But Lee reads the situation perfectly and leaves very, very few troops to watch McClellan's army as it's being dwindled down, and sends almost all of his army back to the old Manassas battlefield. John Pope will lead the Union armies to disaster at Second Bull Run, which can be a little bit complicated, but I'll try to walk you through it. The battlefield is kind of reversed as the Union now is kind of coming in from the south this day. This is all Pope's army that comes in from, this is to Washington up this way. They come in and they are preparing to have battle against Stonewall Jackson, again, entrenched on a ridge. But what happens is, as his men are coming up, he has men who say they've engaged Confederates over here on the left. Pope chastises them and says that they're firing at their own Union men and they need to get into a line, which allows the Union army to get flanked, which is the worst thing that can happen to an army at this time, is to be hit on the end by an army fully spread out like this, and it basically leads to Pope getting entirely crushed and nearly a second skedaddle as Pope's army is forced back to Washington and Pope is essentially fired. But it means that when McClellan returns, he is put back in command because Pope was worse than McClellan was. Then Robert E. Lee makes the decision to advance into the north and advances into Maryland. The Union Army under McClellan again is tracking Lee into Maryland. There's a terrible missed opportunity where Lee's organization and battle plans fell into McClellan's hand. You can watch the video with Ken Burns for some of the details. But he's able to obtain Lee's battle plans but believes it's maybe a fake and misses the opportunity to crush Robert E. Lee's forces when he had the chance. The Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, there's the very large swollen Potomac River at Lee's back, and he's outnumbered massively by McClellan, and it is a 3-part but only 1-day battle. There's terrible fighting up in the north, the center, the south, and again, there's a lot of gory details through the cornfield and the sunken road and Burnside Bridge, and as the Confederate lines just hold and hold and hold, and both sides take terrible casualties, but McClellan all day holds nearly half his army in reserve. And after all the fighting on the one day in September of 1862 at Antietam, Lee's army needed every ounce of luck and skill and courage to hold on that one day, and he braced for impact the next morning because he knew McClellan had 40,000 fresh troops in addition to all the men who'd fought the previous day, but the attack never came. Antietam was already the single bloodiest day in the Civil War, and would be for the entire war, the single bloodiest one-day battle of the war, and McClellan had no stomach to resume it. And so the very next day after that, Lee does something, in theory, very risky. He starts packing up for a retreat over the Potomac River, and he's able to do it. Here's some other examples of the Battle of Antietam. He's able to do it and is able to get away. He's able to hold the defensive and then retreat. McClellan gets fired again, fully for the last time, and is replaced by his own subordinate. They will each get a chance. General Hooker will replace him, and when Burnside will replace him, and when Burnside fails, he'll be replaced by Hooker. When Hooker fails, he gets replaced by Meade, and Meade will last. The final topic for today, which ties into the Battle of Antietam, is Lincoln's evolving views on slavery. As we look at what had happened on this evolution of slavery, remember that as the war started, there was the Corwin Amendment, the original 13th Amendment, where to create an unrepealable guarantee of slavery in the states. It passed the House by 2/3, passed the Senate by 2/3, had Lincoln's approval to prevent a civil war. It was not good enough for the South. Another interesting question: why did non-slave owners fight on behalf of slavery, fight on behalf of the Confederacy? It was part of as strange as it sounds today, part of the American dream of many Southerners to become rich one day, to own slaves one day. It was a status symbol to be like the wealthy planters, and so even non-slave owners admired the system because they wanted to be part of it. They didn't want to destroy it. Many of the non-slave owners also fought for the Confederacy out of a sense of Southern honor, patriotism, a sense of repelling invasion, a very common answer that captured Southerners would give to Northerners. They'd ask, do you own any slaves? They'd say, no. They'd say, why are you fighting? And the Southerner would reply, because you're down here. You've invaded our states and homes, and we're fighting to defend ourselves. They would say, why are you down here? Is what many Southerners would ask. And they're also fighting not to own slaves, but for the concept of white supremacy, social order. Those ideas that the races would never successfully mix, and that abolishing slavery would just bring chaos, they believed. Why was it that the Union opposed secession? They feared, part of it was trade. They feared that cheap British goods would be smuggled in through the South because they would have low tariffs that would undercut their industry. They believed they would lose the shipping trade, that the Europeans would swoop in and do all of the shipping trade with the South. There were a lot of Southerners in debt for land and cotton, seeds before they would pay a crop. They feared that they would just abolish and repudiate their debt. They feared the loss of control at New Orleans and the right of deposit. They were defending democracy, the idea that they had an election, the South didn't like the result, so they left. That's not democracy, they said. And ironically, many immigrants, most European immigrants at that time were settling in the North and the West more than the South. And many immigrants were very pro-American and very pro-Union. They left their homeland that they knew and loved and were raised in and chose America because they loved America and the idea of America. And so the idea that America was such a great country and that people would leave it and try to destroy it really shocked a lot of immigrants. So many first and second generation immigrants were some of the most, and mainly who lived in the North, were very enthusiastic supporters of America and its ideals. And there were finally, yes, some who were fighting to end slavery. Remember, the war becomes a crusade to end slavery as it goes on, and as it goes on, that begins here after the Battle of Antietam. Remember, going into this point, the Republican view was moderate, gradual emancipation. They only began to oppose slavery directly when it became clear the war could only be won by doing so. The South was resolute. They would not give in to those compromises listed above. The Union Army is mismanaged. There would be no quick victory for the Union. And you had African Americans who self-advocated as well, who were very outspoken. You had very eloquent and articulate and assertive black advocates. Frederick Douglass was among the most famous. He was so well educated and well spoken that Southerners didn't believe that he had ever been a slave. So he wrote his autobiography to prove them wrong and give his full story and background. And so for a variety of reasons, the Republican view gradually shifts to a harsher stand on slavery. Lincoln at first thought they would win the war and then resume the anti-slavery crusade. Not before. On the other hand, in the North, you also did have some radicals, led by Pennsylvania Representative Thaddeus Stevens, arguing that the South had lost their rights to slaves and that it's a wartime necessity, that the inexorable logic of events has advanced the cause of abolitionism, and that they would need to attack slavery to hurt the South because of the victories of the Confederate Army. The Union victories, that wherever their army went, slaves would just flock to the Union armies, and the Union armies would rarely, if ever, give slaves back to the plantations. And as Union succeeded more victories, they needed laborers, and they would actually pay the runaway slaves in order to build railroads and act as supply forces, and eventually as a major part of the Union Army. A quick overview of some of the gradual evolution on the topic of what to do with these slaves, and these runaway slaves. May of 1861, when General Ben Butler landed in Virginia, he had runaways, and the Virginia commander demanded these runaway slaves back, and General Butler said, "No, you claim that you're no longer in the Union. How dare you use the Fugitive Slave Act in order to demand them back? If you're not part of the United States, then you can't use its laws to demand something to your benefit." They declare them a contraband of war, that like weapons, you would not give weapons over to your enemy in wartime, so they will not give return slaves as enemies. They call them contraband, or sometimes the singular contrabands. They would refer to an individual runaway slave as a contraband. And they were not required to return them due to the Confiscation Act. They were forfeit. On the other hand, also in 1861, in Missouri, General Fremont tried to say, "I emancipate all the slaves." He was shot down. There's still the fear that more states might secede. In New Orleans, General Ben Butler brought that same attitude of basically, if the slave comes over to the Union Army will keep them and pay them and will not return them to the plantations. So what options does Lincoln have? What did the Republicans have? What did the anti-slavery people have? Gradual emancipation, where you simply pick an age and let slaves age out of slavery. Do you have compensated emancipation? This is not compensation as you maybe hear spoken of today, where you have the government giving a payout to former slaves or the families of former slaves. This is compensating the slave owner, the idea that they are losing a major investment and need to be compensated for the loss of capital. A commonly talked about option was recolonization to Africa, the idea that races couldn't live together, and so that if slaves are freed, that many or most would need or want to be uncolonized, recolonized back to Africa, was sometimes talked about. For a long time, the least likely option seemed to be full emancipation, even though that is the position that will take precedence. We will pick up with the outcomes of 1862 and the Emancipation Proclamation next time. Thanks for watching.